Good morning, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge first the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we gather today, and also that I live and work on Darug and Dharawal country. So I'm going to be talking today about a project coordinated by the Australian Network for Plant Conservation, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors in particular for helping shape this pilot project and all of the project partners, and we'll come to that a little bit later. But first of all, I'm going to take a bit of a step back. We've heard a lot about the importance of ex situ collections over the last few days, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about how those ex situ collections are developed and what we need to think about before getting into the specifics of the project on native guava. A little bit of terminology first. Ex situ collections are ones held away from the native site, so they're off-site. And germplasm is a collective term for all forms of plant material that can be used to create new living plants. So seed, living collections, so whole plants in botanic gardens or arboretum setting, tissue culture, cryostorage. So all these things together are germplasm. And we store both threatened and common species ex situ. So the idea is to be storing as many of Australia's 23,000 species ex situ as possible as insurance collections. But ex situ is really critical for species that are in rapid decline, like some of the Myrtle Rust affected species. It is the only way we have to ensure plants are available for future restoration and recovery action. So these collections facilitate research and collection of practical knowledge that can be used to support species survival, and they also provide a source of material for seed production, education, and raising of awareness. So a little bit about where these ex situ collections are held, wearing my new hat of the Australian Seed Bank Partnership. So there is a Council of Heads of Australian Botanic Gardens with the lovely acronym CHARBAG, and they coordinate the major state-based and national botanic gardens. They're not shown on this map here. And then there's Botanic Gardens Australia and New Zealand, so they're kind of the network organisation for a lot of the regional botanic gardens as well. So they're all really well networked together. The Australian Seed Bank Partnership sits within CHARBAG, and we have 2 staff, and you'll hear from Bradley later this morning. So we're an alliance, as Bob said, of 10 conservation seed banks, the ANPC, Greening Australia, the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership, and a lot of other associates. And you can see all the different kinds of seed collections we have around Australia, so seed banks and then the different types of germplasm storage. So when it comes to collecting germplasm, it's really important to understand whether we want to be looking for seed or other forms of germplasm. And the key question, particularly when it comes to myrtaceae, is the seed available and can it be dried and stored? So those seeds that are really difficult to access and collect, to store as seed using conventional methods, or to germinate and use as healthy living plants later, are sometimes collectively known as exceptional species. And you'll hear from some of today's speakers more about exceptional species. For these exceptional species, it's really important that we have living collections. So they might be nursery collections or in-ground collections at botanic gardens or arboreta. And there's also a movement towards having more dispersed collections or metacollections like the one I'm going to talk about today. And there's a fantastic article called Towards the Metacollection by Botanic Gardens Conservation International in the US. So the key takeaway is that particularly for these exceptional species that are difficult to collect, store and use, living collections are what we need. So now I'll go on to the pilot project about native guava, and there are some videos and some webinar recordings on the ANPC YouTube channel if you'd like to delve more into this. But we had project funding from the Australian government for 12 months to establish a meta collection that was dispersed across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and the ACT. The effect on native guava, as you've heard, is severe and widespread. Many populations that previously supported mature stands of trees are now only available as sucker fields. So getting out there in a urgent fashion was really important. So the custodial partners engaged for this project were selected from a wide range of possible sites for their geographic spread, and also to minimise the likelihood of impact, not just from myrtle rust, but from other climatic and catastrophic events such as bushfire. So we definitely had those collections secure over a long period of time. And the partners also had to be ready to spray for myrtle rust if it arrived. So that, for some gardens, was a deal breaker because that's not something that they wanted to do on an ongoing basis. So at the beginning of the project, even before we had this funding, we were identifying project partners, including those custodial partners who were going to look after the plants at other locations. And it's important to recognise that these key staff are spread across an organisation. They're not just in management, they're in the nursery, they're in horticulture, they're in the research labs. And then there are other project agreements that we developed to support this with our conservation agencies, with forestry and pathology. And as well as those project agreements, we had a materials transfer agreement or a plant sharing deed to formalise that sharing of germplasm. So in this project, we were fortunate to have a phase of germplasm capture and in situ monitoring. Now, a lot of the germplasm in New South Wales had already been collected from about 2015 onwards by Craig Sten at the Saving Our Species program of DPE, and so that material was already held at the Australian Botanic Garden Mount Annan. But this project allowed us to extend the in situ monitoring and germplasm capture into Queensland so that we know we're capturing the full extent of the species. So the material was collected because seed is not generally available. They were collected as suckers or as cuttings from the field and then brought into the nursery. So this is a picture of Tracy, who's here, with the collections at the nursery in Gympie. So there's a lot of things to think about when you're developing these ex situ collections. Some of them will be very obvious and some of them perhaps less so. So I'm going to talk about this as the kind of steps to success that other people can follow if they're developing these collections. So when we select the accessions to distribute to partners, you want to do that selection that's informed by genetic analysis. So like Jason and Stephanie have talked about. You need to be selecting and preparing the planting sites and considering the maintenance and backup systems you have available. So that includes being ready to spray, having the appropriate chemical handling training, having the fungicides available, knowing what you have to go and get off the shelf if that's required, and having not just your regular systems, but your backup systems for irrigation and things like that as well. So having that expert horticultural input, as Richard was talking about, is really key to successfully maintaining these collections. So for the propagation, the maintenance and dispersal phase. You can read a case study about establishing these ex situ guava collections in the germplasm guidelines, and there's lots of other case studies about myrtle rust susceptible species as well, and about making ex situ collections in general. So as the project began, we wanted to make sure we had really clear expectations around how these ex situ collections were going to be monitored over time. So we had some training for key project and support staff. This was an introduction to myrtle rust, how we expected them to observe and monitor myrtle rust, and a framework where they could use a paper-based system or the EpiCollect app that Craig developed. So there's an in situ monitoring project in EpiCollect, and then we developed an ex situ monitoring project as well for native guava. And then also we had horticultural support where Veronica talked about plant management, keeping the plants to a suitable height so they were easy to spray and easier to look after, and things like that. So making sure everyone was on the same page. And one of the big outcomes of the project is that everyone felt better informed about myrtle rust in general, how to recognise it, what to do, how to respond if they did have an incursion of myrtle rust, and so generally feeling more confident about that. When it comes further into the project, the transport of plants was arranged, and then they're planted out. But what you may not realise is that each time these plants are moved, there are records that move with them as well. So there's information that goes from the point where they are going out, so it was the Australian Botanic Garden Mount Annan in this instance, out to all those custodial partners, and then there was information with local accession numbers and their planting locations coming back to the records management system so that everything can be managed collectively. So it's really important to have support for that as well. We're also fortunate to have some funding to develop communications around this. So we were able to create a couple of different videos on the north coast of New South Wales, and then we used these to have a webinar where we shared the information. So towards the end of the project, we're collating data on the project. We can see that these plants that have been shared are producing fruit in the field. We can see where there's a high incidence of myrtle rust and there has to be a very active spray program. And we can see that where there are plants in these new locations that are not so much affected by myrtle rust. However, there are other things affecting the plants. So, irrigation outages or chance events that can mean you're losing plants from those collections. So you need to be prepared for all the things that affect plant health and survival, not just myrtle rust. So as a result of this short project and the work that had happened for a long time beforehand, more improvements to the species trajectory were made. So there's more robust insurance collections. The species is sampled across its distribution and genetic analysis is underway for those Queensland collections. There's a large set of lineages available in the nursery at Mount Annan and at Gympie, and they're represented as this track set of lineages that is 75 plants across 5 locations. So a big thank you to all our project partners in these organisations. If I have 1 minute, I'll just get everyone who's been involved in this project to stand up. Say thank you. They are people across everyone involved in the project, past and current. So this is for one species for a short period of time. Thank you. Thank you. And I think the best benefit that people found over and above securing these plants in collections was the linking with other organisations and feeling more capable and prepared about how to deal with myrtle rust. And one of our project partners, who's a horticulturalist, bush regenerator, said it removed the notion that myrtle rust is a death sentence, even for the worst impacted species, as long as we followed all the management procedures on an ongoing basis. So I think that was a really good outcome. If I take it out big picture now, we have an idea about what we can do for this one species, but there's another 20 to 40 species that urgently require this approach. We need to be investing in our nursery facilities, our seed banks and botanic gardens, because for many of these collections, the exit plan of getting them back out into the wild is not happening yet. So we end up holding these collections for a really long period of time in a place where they are quite, the maintenance intensive. And we can involve partners not just in those big botanic gardens, but in a range of regional botanic gardens and community organisations. And I think from projects like this, we can develop a better coordination. So the kind of workflows and agreements and records management to smooth the way for when this happens in future. And there's also some global models for this, like the Global Conservation Consortium model of BGCI that we can use to learn from as well. A big thank you to my co-authors, and you're very welcome to get in touch with them or to speak to any of the people that stood up earlier. Thank you very much.